founder and interim CEO of the Clean Energy Fund of Texas that is working to make green energy available and affordable to everyone, independent of their means. And he's also the president of Capital Assets Energy, which is a clean energy development consulting outfit that does CPACE programs and others. But I do want to give a little background. He started his career as an intern in the Clinton White House. You don't look old enough actually to have been there, Stephen. And then went on to work in congressional offices of Sheila Jackson Lee and Sylvester Turner. He was VP of Public Advocacy in Texas for the Heart Association and did a lot of advocacy there and with his own firm on health issues, such as health issues, as well as mass transit and environmental justice issues. He was the 2014 Democratic nominee for Texas Railroad Commissioner, and we're really grateful that he has been willing to lead this charge. Just to give you a little context, TxETRA has been facilitating the discussion with a equity committee for the past many months. And we've been delving into this issue of how do you bring justice and equity into the realm of electric transportation. So there's been a lot of brainstorming going on. I know we have some of the folks that have been participating in that here. Edward Morgan has, and Patricia Zavala, they're both here, and Janice Bookout. So hopefully you all will chime in. But with that, Stephen is going to sort of take us down a road of talking about justice in electric transportation, and as well as coming up with a lot of the ideas, or sharing with you a lot of the ideas that that the Equity Committee has started brainstorming on. So Stephen, thank you again for being willing to do this, and take it away.
Well, thank you, Laura. And although I may not look old enough to work for the Clintons, I definitely feel older now, since you put it that way. Back in the 1900s or so, I was in DC helping them out. But look, I am glad to be here now, working with you on this roadmap. Can you go to the next slide, please, Aaron? So what we're going to do today, it really shouldn't take a whole lot of time, but we're just going to kind of go over what we think are some of the opportunities to integrate justice and equity into the discussions that are going to be shaping the roadmap, and embed those concepts more deeply into the roadmap, in addition to having, a section of the roadmap committed to just transportation and equitable access to infrastructure. So what we're going to do today is we're going to first kind of give a baseline on some of the concepts, what we mean when we say justice, what we mean when we say equity, what we mean when we discuss social justice and environmental justice. From there, we will look at some of the opportunities that the working group has been eyeing over the last couple of months. And then we'll finally wrap up with a framework through which we want to be able to funnel these concepts and ideas into the roadmap in a way that that allows a roadmap to really have a centering around just transportation as we evolve into a more electric fleet of vehicles out in Texas. Okay, next. So let's talk a little bit about some of the concepts that we will be referring to this afternoon. Next slide. So I'll give you all a second to kind of take a look at this graphic. I think it illustrates access to resources and the distribution of resources as it relates to where your position may be in society. And I think it's a very impressive illustration. It's not mine. Laura found this on the internet somewhere. But I think it's a perfect illustration of, when we talk about equity, when we talk about justice, what the true differences are between the two, and understanding, how a big piece of this is a systemic problem, and our needing to be able to address the systemic problems as well as the access to distributed resources problems as well. And that's kind of what we want to embed into the roadmap. Okay, next question. Next slide. So here are some pretty generic definitions for social justice and environmental justice. Essentially, social justice is the idea that all people should have equal access to wealth, health, well-being, justice, privileges, and opportunity. Again, the key there is that everyone has equal access to those things. Not that everyone receives those things, but everyone should have equal access to those things. Environmental justice is defined as, mandates the right to ethical balance and responsible uses of land and renewable resources. To kind of back up, the definition is environmental justice encompasses the fair treatment of all people with respect to environmental laws, regulations, and policies. Okay, next slide. And of course, there's a lot of overlap between the two. And what we'll be dealing with today is more or less how both of these different concepts work and what they mean within the context of electric transportation. But essentially, social justice, environmental justice, I think most of us are already pretty familiar with some of the instances and cases of both and how those things, are actually revealed in real life. So let's go to the next slide. And so now we want to kind of, frame those concepts within the context of electric transportation. So when we talk about social justice, we're talking about, investments in transportation electrification to increase access and security for low-income consumers. Investment in transportation electrification must equitably allocate costs and benefits as well. And then, of course, environmentally, we want to look to reduce air pollution. We want to look to reduce carbon emissions and a lot of the public health issues that the American Lung Association folks just laid out for us. Next slide. And then finally, looking at, again, some of the concepts, making sure that everyone is level set on, what we mean when we discuss some of these concepts. As it relates to energy justice now, we believe that there is a recognition-based justice, there's a distributional justice, and a procedural justice. And as you can imagine, recognition-based justice calls us to acknowledge who is being affected. Distribution justice highlights the ways benefits, risk, and responsibilities are divided unequally throughout the energy system. And then procedural involves stakeholders being involved in the decision-making process in a non-discriminatory way. Okay, next slide. So those are the concepts. And now we're going to dig into how we relate those concepts into opportunities to be addressed by this group and to amplify these opportunities more broadly publicly. Next slide. So first, we're actually going to look at procedural justice because we believe that procedural justice is indeed a very has the ability for us to make a real impact on the process itself as we talk about the deployment of these resources. And so in this section, we're going to talk about access to electric transportation arena in general, community involvement, community-driven solutions, and then education and outreach. Okay, next slide. So what we've been looking at as it relates to procedural justice as a committee is on this slide. And I can walk through some of those opportunities here as it relates to access, looking at opportunities for hosting workshops and events, working with the community to define what a community-centered ride and drive may look like. Again, procedurally, we want to make sure that the terms that we use when we discuss these things aren't too wonky. We want to make sure that we're speaking in terms that people can understand and not, solely in technical terms. Again, education exposure is going to be important. Language access as a lens for marketing, and then growing a better familiarity with EV programs and benefits. Next slide. Now, here we talk about access to electric transportation, and we're talking specifically about personal vehicles, alternatives to personal vehicles like public transit, alternatives to transportation in general, which drives into more broadband type issues, and then more broadly fleet and commercial transportation. So next slide, please. And so the opportunities there we see are going to relate to affordability. And under affordability, we're looking at should access to lower cost, higher quality vehicles, equitable dealership experiences, public transportation kind of speaks for itself, equitable approach to electrification of public transportation and EV adoption fleets to help offset air pollution, which should be considered a priority. And then when we talk about access to electric transportation, we are really going to spend a lot of time looking at credit and financing. We want to ensure that credit risk are mitigated for folks who may be seen as a credit risk in traditional financing markets, but that they have access as well to EVs. We want to obviously prevent predatory practices, looking at loan programs that are scalable to the affordability of vehicles. For instance, green banks are like mine is taking a deep dive into looking at what a EV loan might look like for disadvantaged communities. And so we look forward to presenting some options there. And then finally, rebates and incentives, as well as leasing programs, all of which could help to improve access to electric transportation. Next slide. Now we're talking about infrastructure here, the charging infrastructure. Obviously, we want it to be geographic distributed equitably. We want to look at public charging, residential charging, and workplace charging. Okay, next slide. And so the committee has been looking at opportunities for improving access to charging infrastructure through by looking at communities that traditionally would not have adequate infrastructure. For one, looking at emphasizing culturally relevant sites. How do we ensure community members are accessing new infrastructure? How do we ensure that added infrastructure does not facilitate displacement? We were talking about rental property access opportunities, as well as supporting obviously work and charging work sites. Next slide. And then finally, I believe this is our last bucket of opportunities as it relates to economic opportunities, wealth creation, job creation, and workforce training. Okay. So here we're focused on, one, capacity building for small businesses, in addition to creating a wealth building mindset. And then obviously looking at capacity building for small businesses, where we're talking about contracting opportunities. We're talking about planning that prioritizes equal distribution of contracts between large and small businesses, equalizing the playing field, supporting Texas-based companies, charging companies, so forth and so on. Gap filling financial support is important, is needed, important, and then other incentives for small businesses. And then obviously this evolving, emerging industry is going to create a great deal of job opportunities and career opportunities for a lot of folks who live in disadvantaged communities. And so we want to take a look at what types of trainings might be needed and to what extent we're advocating for those types of trainings, as well as opportunities for communities to crowdfund investment and begin to build wealth and equity through a crowdfunding type of platform. And several of those exist today, particularly around renewable energy projects. And so we like to kind of see how that might fit with this as well. Next slide. Oh, and then lastly, resilience. Obviously, resiliency is going to be the key as well when we talk about equity. Addressing pollution hotspots, and then how these vehicles and the batteries might be used to benefit resilience and to harden the grid in parts of the state that may lack the sufficient infrastructure to be able to support the community, once the power goes out for whatever reason. There are a lot of reasons why power goes out in the state, but how these batteries might be able to add a added resource, added value to communities, either through second life opportunities, bi-directional charging, and then utilizing fleet batteries to power some resilient centers during disasters. Maybe using electric buses to be a rolling resilience center for communities. In the next slide. Okay, so the framework, next slide, please. So the framework itself visions a lot of how we put those opportunities together through this type of a lens where we're defining the goals, values, missions, the process, kind of that procedural justice part that we talked about, the implementation, and then the analysis and measurement. And this is just a really good guide that that we will be using as we create our chapter of the roadmap, but also a really cool guide that can be used throughout the roadmap itself as we look to integrate these concepts into a roadmap for Texas that will allow for equity and justice to be very real and prevalent in the new emerging infrastructure that's being created that we will all benefit from for years to come. I think that's it.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, well, that was a lot. As I mentioned, the Equity Committee's been meeting and brainstorming about these ideas for a long time, but would love to hear people's reactions, questions, and then specifically, I know that a lot of your outfits that are here joining us today, a lot of your outfits work specifically and have some specific focuses on equity, diversity, and all of that. So, for you all, for instance, to share with us the kinds of things that you're working on already to get into the mix would be really useful. Hannah, you can go ahead and take the, yeah, there you go. Yeah. So any thoughts? And I should mention, let's see, Patricia is here. Patricia Zavala, Amanda Alondes is with us also. Dale has a question.
Yes, do we know if TxETRA is already committed to putting the all-electric buses in these neighborhoods that have the highest pollution level rather than scattering them around the city? It seems to me if that's where the need is the greatest, that's where the zero-emission buses should go first.
I don't know the answer to that. And that's a question not just for TxETRA, but Houston bus system is going 100% electric. And as we just heard, they have some of the worst pollution in the country there. That's a really great point to just think about generally.
Yep, I agree.
I have an answer for that question.
Go for it, Janice.
Sorry, one second. Sorry, I'm getting an echo to come off of this other one. Sorry. Yeah, so I've had that conversation with with some folks at TxETRA, and my understanding is that they are thinking from that perspective, Dale, and planning from that perspective, but also the way that their buses run, it's spread throughout. So there's not like areas where one bus is used. They're all deployed in all areas on a rotation. So that's what I understand to be true about Cap Metro, but they are looking at future planning from that perspective.
But that's a good point, Dale. That could certainly be captured just as a general thing for every metro area to consider.
The same should be true with the school buses. As we electrify our school buses, the schools that are in the most polluted areas ought to get them first.
Well, I can tell you that the Clean School Bus program that the EPA is currently, I believe they have them open, is completely on the same page as you there, Dale. And they have prioritized certain school districts. And I believe that they're the school districts that are in high pollution and disadvantaged communities. So that's precisely what they're doing. That, in fact, that was with the last round too. But it's a good thing to keep our eyes on in general. I think there's a certain element of that too in terms of port electrification, et cetera, looking at the areas that have the highest air pollution. Other comments?
Or questions?
Yeah, and you know, the opportunities that we've been discussing, it's not an exhaustive list, right? And so there may be some that we've missed as well. And so I think, you know, to Janice's point, if you have ideas about other ways that, you know, we can ensure an opportunity for a more equitable distribution of resources and access to those resources, you know, please feel free to let us know, and we'll be sure to consider and include those into our formal write-up when we're finished.
That's right. And I just want to emphasize what Stephen said in terms of thinking in terms of the framework. There are specific things we need to think about for equity in electric transportation in the future, but we also want to use that framework to help us just keep an eye on all the rest of it, so that inequities don't, you know, so that we avoid any systemic inequities in the program itself, in the roadmap itself. Other comments? I see Jamie Mitchell's here. Jamie, I know that Austin Energy has a lot of good programs working on equity in electric transportation.
Yeah, we have an equity officer with the city that we work with, and we also have somebody full-time who's committed to equity in our EV program. So we're working on it. And
yeah. Do you know any of the specifics of the kinds of things that are
no, I
that?
don't. I'm happy to get the right person in touch with you. And Carl's not on this call, so my apologies. I do know they're just looking at certain housing developments over on the east side in our town and things like that, and not just new construction. You know, the nice, not just the gentrified areas. We got to be real careful on that. So let me find out. I'm kind of curious myself, and we'll go from there.
Okay. Well, and that's one of the things, I don't, Stephen had to go through those lists pretty quickly, but one of the things in terms of charging access that's on the list is to make sure that it's not, that when you put charging access in, it's not a driver for gentrification, that, you know, you have to make sure you service the folks that are there, which might take more than just putting a charging station in. I guess I could also mention that Stephen and I are talking with somebody from Foundation Communities, which is an affordable housing developer here in town. And they are, and also a little bit in Dallas. They've been around forever. They're terrific. They have thousands of units and have done a lot of good sustainability things, including putting charging stations in some of their low-income affordable housing. And what they found is those are public charging, so people can that don't live there can come. And what they found is, well, their residents don't really have electric vehicles, so they're not really being used. So we're brainstorming with them about ways to put programs together to really help provide that access, so they'll be able to enjoy the benefits, especially of the cost savings that can mean so much to somebody.
I know we've been trying for years to get the city of Austin to put charging stations in all of their public libraries, which are in all parts of the city. But as far as I know, we still don't have charging stations, and it's city property, so it should be easy to get the permits. But I've been completely a failure in trying to make that happen.
I think that there actually is at least one, Dale. I think maybe the Twin Oaks has one. Also, I should mention that the Givens Park, they're very aware of that, and it's something that every metropolitan area is probably thinking about. But Givens is a neighborhood in East Austin, traditionally lower income neighborhood, African-American neighborhood, and they are doing, they're redoing their park plan right now, and they are putting a charging station in there. So that's pretty great. They're moving on it. Okay, questions, comments? I know, I think Edward might have left. Edward Morgan with Revitalized Solutions has been part of the discussions. Janice and also Patricia, if you're still here. I don't know if you're still here, if you want to make any comments, add to anything. Patricia's also on our board.
I do.
don't
1
see-
second.
There, there she is. Patricia's still on board.
Yep, and yeah, maybe she had to step away for a minute. Go ahead, Janice.
Yeah, I mean, I did want to say, Laura, that first of all, thank you, Stephen, for a great and very comprehensive presentation. And I also just acknowledge the work of the equity team. It's a diverse group of perspectives on that team. We're growing that team as well because we want to get as many lived experiences, geographic representations, professional experiences, kind of all on that team, and really represent Texas fully in all of its diversity. So I just really appreciate the work of the team, and excited about that. And if there's anybody that's interested in joining us, I think that would be great. But yeah, and then I just, I think it might be interesting, Stephen, to maybe on the call, working in your various sectors, what are you seeing? First of all, are there any of those? What do you feel is being done most thoroughly right now? Where would you say, as an industry, we are addressing those issues effectively? And then where are we not? Where are the areas that you think we need the most work, and why? I would like to hear that from folks on the call if you have insight into, and maybe to, it's a lot of information. So maybe kind of just going back to the topic areas, Stephen, real quick, to kind of run through them and then see what people have to say about that. And if they wanted to put it in the chat or comment publicly, either one, I think that would be real.
Janice, you're fading in and out a little bit, but I think I get the gist of it. You're asking folks what they see as working or not working, maybe, in each of the different areas. One thing I think is easy to talk about is locations of charging stations. And I think, we have charging companies here. I know I've heard folks talk specifically about their monitoring of where their charging stations are going, and then trying to ensure that they're being distributed in all parts of their areas. I don't know if anybody has comments on that. Joseph Bartlett, I see you there. You all sure install a bunch of charging stations. Do you have any perspective on where those charging stations are going geographically?
I mean, no, what we're seeing is because of supply chain issues and just the used car market in general, we were installing a lot of charging stations in the more disadvantaged areas when that particular demographic could get their hands on some of these used EVs at a really good price. But over the past few months, we've seen the used EV price really skyrocketed, which actually had an adverse effect on those targeted market areas where we were doing installations more and more in. And so with the increase in costs on used EVs, I think we've seen kind of a slowdown on where we're installing those charging stations. So I'm really excited to see that the state and other organizations are pushing to really ramp that movement back up, because it really was it was really good to see the charging station kind of infrastructure allocated across the city, not just in certain areas where the money was there. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, well, and if you're talking, I think you're referring to the NEVI money that Michael Chamberlain was just talking about. And, you know, that funding is federal funding, and it is subject to the executive order called Justice 40, which says that 40% of all the benefits of the federal investment needs to go to disadvantaged communities. And the feds have put together a map. I can find it and put a link in the chat in a minute. Their disadvantaged community electric vehicle charging map. And so it's not clear exactly what they mean. And it's a map of the communities they consider disadvantaged when it comes to EV charging. And it's not just where the charging stations are, it's also, for instance, who's affected by air pollution and things like that. And they haven't said exactly, and I know Michael Chamberlain, they have a TBD pending comment on that in their plan. They're not exactly sure how it's supposed to be, that 40% is supposed to be measured. So it could be that 40% of the money needs to be invested in those, quote, disadvantaged communities, but this will really come down a lot to the money, the way the MPOs spend their money. But I assume that you're going to see a lot of that picking up again because of that. I'll go look for that link right now.
I think you're. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. I was just going to say, I think I interrupted your flow, Janice.
No, I really appreciate what you said, Joseph, because it reminds me of some conversations we've had about how, you know, there's two ways to look at this emerging market. One of them is from more like of a technological standpoint, where we would be dictated by the rules of technology, you know, and all the things like, you know, planned obsolescence and interoperability wouldn't be as much of a thing. And, you know, just equitable distribution, you know, would be driven by the market, which we know how that goes. But because it's a public, because it's really an industry that's replacing, the infrastructure is replacing public infrastructure that has a whole different set of priorities. And I think one thing that I hadn't considered as much that I'd like to hear more about, and maybe in another time, but I would like to hear more about what the barriers from your side of things are, you know, because if expecting companies to pick up all that slack is probably unrealistic, right? So it's got to be a dance between public support and private readiness and marketplace, right? And I just was, what you pointed to was, I think, a really, really on point. Thanks for saying that.
Yeah, so I guess, Laura, if anyone has any other ideas and comments that they want to share, they can definitely do that with us at another time. If there are some best practices that you've seen or that you've experienced that your company is experimenting with, we would love to know, you know, what that is as it relates to, you know, what we discussed, and just make sure that we have as thorough of a picture of how this fits into the overall roadmap as possible before we conclude with this work.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. Michael, did you have comments? I saw you unmuted.
I just wanted to comment and say, as part of the early team that was working on this, I thought the presentation was excellent. And I want to thank Stephen for serving as chair on this critical platform area, and I thought it came out really good.